Sandro Botticelli was a hugely successful artist. Wealthy, famous, at the height of his career. But we know very little about him. We do know that he was born in Florence in 1445 or 1446, and that he spent most of his life there. We know that he'd come very close to the centre of power in Florence. Botticelli's Florence wasn't just a city, it was a state in itself. Independent, confident and democratic, at least in name. It had a powerful economy based on foreign trade, the leather industry, and above all, gold. There was a hugely wealthy merchant class, rich patrons with time on their hands, turning their minds to art. Renaissance means rebirth, and the rebirth of the arts in Florence took its inspiration from the arts in ancient Rome. But artists interpreted these figures in an entirely new way, gave their bodies dynamic movement, and set them against realistic landscapes, even when the figures themselves were mythical. At an early age, Botticelli had shown himself to be an adept Renaissance artist, skilled in the techniques that gave a new realism to painting, the play of light and shade, foreshortening and perspective. As he became more confident, he began to develop a style of his own, less tied to the conventions of the day, but hugely in demand. His drawings overflowed with the promise of sex, or with bodies lazing in its afterglow. Almost all of Botticelli's work was commissioned by the family dynasties that were emerging in Florence, none more powerful nor more feared than the Medicis. This isn't just a nativity scene, it's a political painting. It shows Cosimo de' Medici and his sons in the roles of the wise men at the birth of Christ. Tensions between rival families were turning to violence and murder, so artistic versatility and flattering your patrons were a good way of making a living and staying alive. This may also be the only existing image of Botticelli from the time, a self-portrait. Botticelli is known as the great explorer of beauty, but these were frightening, brutal times. Giuliano de' Medici was attacked and killed in a chapel while at prayer, so Botticelli, the great examiner of beauty, painted the hanging of his murderers on the door of a church.
There's nothing more visceral than a little-known and ghastly set of 4 paintings by Botticelli, in which a young, unrequited lover wanders in a forest, and lo and behold, he sees a ghastly event taking place. A naked woman being pursued by a knight on horseback who catches her after hunting her down. And his dogs tear her limb from limb, indeed, chew out her liver and carry it to the far corners of the scene. This is a narrative which Botticelli illustrates with appalling relish, and apparently presents as part of a wedding gift for a married couple. And in that sense, there is in Botticelli something quite different from the understanding of the beautiful for its own sake, which perhaps since the 19th century has been the current view of what he does. There's an appetite for conflict, an understanding of tension, and of pain and jealousy as well.
This is a work about pain and ecstasy. A sequence of drawings by one of the great masters. It's a journey down through the circles of hell. the terraces of Purgatory and into the outer reaches of space. Botticelli's drawings for the Divine Comedy are unique.
My immediate reaction was, these are the most beautiful things I've ever seen. There's something about the economy of his line, the way he manages to get over meaning just with a single gesture or expression.
It's very unfashionable nowadays to talk about genius. But there are certain individuals to whom it is given to do unbelievably extraordinary things, and it most definitely is one of the great works of the Renaissance.
I love the drawings. I actually live and breathe and think these drawings.
Botticelli is a very agile drawer. I mean, he's an absolute kind of virtuoso. He was a virtuoso stylist.
When I first looked at the drawings, what first struck me was their extreme delicacy and their extreme beauty. Also the fact that quite a few of them are quite funny. I think he has a great eye for a devil. There are some fantastic little devils writhing around, prodding people.
He's like no other illustrator I know. It's like seeing a movie when you look at these drawings. The way the figures move. They're not just snapshots, as most illustrators did. They're moving pictures.
The drawings are illustrations for the greatest work of Italian literature. Dante Alighieri had completed the Divine Comedy 170 years before, in 1321. It quickly established itself as the first masterpiece of Italian literature, and Dante as its first great poet.
Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. How hard it is to tell what it was like, this wood of wilderness, savage and stubborn. The thought of it brings back all my old fears. A bitter place. Death could scarce be bitterer. But if I would show the good that came of it, I must talk about things other than the good.
Dante places himself at the center of the work, a man who, at the age of 35, has arrived at a midlife crisis point. Dante can only solve this crisis by a journey to the depths of human despair and the height of ecstasy. His journey is the journey of the soul. This was the first major work written in Italian, and it wasn't just about religion, but about the philosophy, politics, art, and science of the day.
When people first read it, I'm sure they were very impressed. The fact is that it was written in Italian and not in Latin, so that everybody could read it at the time. Most things were written in Latin. Dante meant it to be read by everybody, and the purpose of the Divine Comedy was to save mankind. That's the reason he wrote it. But it's called comedy because it has a happy ending. It begins in misery and ends in happiness, and that's why we call it the comedy. The Divine Comedy. I mean, the saving of one's soul and the guidance of one's life on earth. What could be more important than that?
Dante addressed the journey of the soul using the best science available to him. People now understood that the earth was a globe, although they believed that the heavenly bodies, the moon, sun and stars, revolved around the earth.
in Dante's day, it was just at the end of that moment when you could know everything that was known, everything about biology, everything about physics, everything about religion, everything about literature. You could actually carry it all in one head. And he's the last head carrying it, and so he makes a kind of whole world.
By Botticelli's time, anyone who wanted to be considered educated had read the Divine Comedy. The invention of the printing press was making it widely available. It is a very visual work. Everything is described in terms of what it looks like, and it was crying out to be illustrated.
Hell is a pit, going down from the surface to the centre of the earth. And the pit has been created by the fall of Satan. Satan thundering down from heaven at the fall of the angels, strikes into the centre of the earth and does what?
He makes the bloody great hole. And that's quite impressive. And it's a hole as big as the mountain is that's going to take you up to heaven.
If you follow the logic of it through, he displaces an equal and opposite amount of material. And where does that material go? It goes through the centre of the earth and emerges in the southern hemisphere at the antipodes of Jerusalem and forms the Mount of Purgatory.
Botticelli certainly wasn't the first artist to illustrate the Divine Comedy. From the beginning, people had produced illuminated manuscripts with footnotes and illustrations to explain what was happening and why. But Botticelli's work was something new. He had a scribe write out each of the 100 chapters or cantos of the Divine Comedy. Then he placed a single drawing above each canto.
It was designed to be read as a book, and although individual drawings are very beautiful, when seen alone, I think that what really pays off is to look at them together, to look at them in sequence, to be carried through and taken along with the story.
Botticelli was placing his drawings on an equal footing with Dante's words. This was making a big claim, the equivalent of saying, "I am as great as Shakespeare," but his confidence was justified.
There's no question that the most beautiful, the most profound, the most sensitive meeting with Dante was the one that he had with Botticelli, just because of the quality of Botticelli's line.
Botticelli has got a really good idea of what Dante's up to. Dante's like almost the first novelist. And Botticelli is really up to speed on what's happening. You know, he is a kind of serial. What Botticelli achieves is animation before it exists, cartoon drawing before it exists. You know, that thing that cartoon draftsmen can do, which I can't, which is draw the same guy in every position, as if, you know, you can draw Popeye one way, you can draw him the other. And Botticelli can do that. And then he can do it on, you know, 3 or 4 times on one sheet with a serial event happening, just like a page of an American cartoon. It's very brilliantly done.
The drawings were made for one of the Medici family, Lorenzo de Pierfrancesco, a man who steered clear of his cousin's violent power struggles and who gave Botticelli complete artistic control. It was common practice in Botticelli's time for an artist to include objects, people and gestures that had a symbolic or personal meaning for their patron.
People would argue with me, but I would think that with certain paintings, large-scale paintings, important commissions, he would have been given at least a list of what are the images that have to be in that work. With these drawings, how can you imagine a patron going through the 100 cantos of the Divine Comedy, stipulating how many 50 figures, 100 figures per drawing, which figures, which episodes? It's not feasible. The drawings that we see today are the result of the mind and the hand of Sandro Botticelli, and no one else.
Botticelli lived near the great abattoirs and tanneries of Florence. He made the drawings on parchment. Animal skins are cured with salt, stretched and cut. Goatskin parchment is especially sought after. It has an extremely fine texture. It's translucent and very long-lasting. Botticelli began by marking faint lines in the parchment with a metal stylus. He then went over these faint lines in ink. Botticelli worked on the 100 drawings between 1481 and 1495, but he never finished them. In some places he has not inked over the stylus lines. In others he's moved objects from one position to another.
From my perspective, they are in some ways more valuable because they were never completed. What we look at is Botticelli's mind working, and we see the process of the making of an illustration from one stage to a next. They reveal his thought processes and the changes that he made in the course of making the illustrations.
There is little doubt that Botticelli intended the drawings to be coloured, and some were, but not by Botticelli himself. It was common practice for an assistant to add in colour following the artist's instructions, but the colouring here seems to be by more than one assistant.
The great tragedy, I think, that someone treated it like a colouring-in book, and some of them were very professionally done by someone who's very used to making coloured miniatures. But the standards differ. I don't know who they're by. It's a big mistake anyway, and the worst of them is terrible, really a terrible artist.
But Botticelli coloured this first drawing himself, the chart of hell. The drawing is only 50 centimetres high, but incredibly detailed.
With a magnifying glass, we can see so much more than we can with the naked eye. Tiny, tiny, tiny. I mean, not an eighth of an inch, not a 16th of an inch, even smaller. It's inconceivable how Botticelli actually drew them.
Hell is divided into 9 circles where the damned are locked forever in punishment, with no hope of escape. The deeper levels of hell represent the graver sins, and the punishments are correspondingly more severe. This is the entire underworld in miniature, a map of the journey that Dante is about to undertake, and the characters he'll meet along the way. At the bottom of the pit is the devil himself. Dante's guide through hell and purgatory is the Roman poet Virgil. Dante considered Virgil to be the greatest poet of the ancient world, and himself to be the great poet of the new world. Botticelli shows Virgil taking care of Dante, guiding his reactions to the horrors of the underworld.
There is a sort of reverence, there is a tenderness also of Virgil towards Dante, but it's also love, because we know that Dante absolutely adored reading Virgil, no? And Botticelli has caught it very well in the facial expressions and also in the gestures. It's very touching, I think. That is a motive, a leitmotif that runs, I should say, through the whole series of drawings.
A devilish boatman brings Dante and Virgil to the gates of the walled city of Dis, where the torments of hell really begin.
I saw more than 1,000 fiendish angels perching above the gates, enraged, screaming. Who is the one approaching? Who, without death, dares walk into the kingdom of the dead?
The world of the senses in hell is very strange. There's quite a lot of noise, but it's mostly chaos because there's no music in hell. Music isn't allowed. Occasionally there might be some kind of squawk that gets near music. So there's lots of noise. I suspect it smelt pretty much like Florence did in Dante's day anyway, which was a pretty smelly place. I mean, everything was in the gutter, and the meat shops were more like abattoirs than they were like modern Tesco's or anything like that.
It's like the story of hell, you know that one. You get to hell, and you're immersed in a sea of mud and filth. And standing there, and the one chap says, I don't think that's too bad. And then the voice says, the tea breaks over on your heads, chaps.
The Simonists were corrupt clergy, stuffed into holes one on top of the next. As a new one is added, the ones beneath get squashed down further.
Popes are quite likely to find themselves, if they incur Dante's wrath, turned upside down with their feet waggling in the air, oiled and set alight, flickering as Christmas puddings might flicker.
I think Dante takes particular pleasure in seeing people suffer, and I think obviously a lot of the illustrators of Dante have also taken pleasure in that kind of thing.
There's a personal element. I mean, it's a wonderful way of getting rid of personal grievances, is to write a book of the worst punishments you can think of and stick your enemies into it one by one. I think the popes have a bad time. I think I have it in for them, because I'm really on Dante's side. Because I think if you become pope, then your job really is to be not corrupt. And so that's a kind of double deficit in your personality. To be a bad pope is really to be bad.
There was the view around that the blessed in heaven would have a certain enjoyment in seeing some people in hell. Some of the students I have at the Gregorian University, they say, well, surely in heaven, I mean, the blessed will see some people in hell and that will make them feel even happier. And I said, that's a very unchristian thought.
If you see it as an expression of comeuppance, or God's righteousness or justice, then you could take pleasure in that sense, but not, one shouldn't on the human level.
We're invited to learn from the suffering. He is learning about what each sin is in the Inferno, how to cure it in the Purgatory, and finally how to arrive at God in unity at the end in the Paradiso.
Actually, I don't know if I can say this on TV, but there is definitely that there are, figures in hell who are making fairly obscene gestures if you look at it closely. I think that the kind of rudeness and kind of sexy farce of some of the episodes in the Inferno is something that Botticelli definitely relishes.
I'm sure when the Medici prince and his friends saw all those heads stuck in all the shit, they probably had a good laugh. And in hell, there are a number of jokes, and it's kind of funny too. But I mean, it's terrifying funny.
Before they turned left face along the bank, each one gave their good captain a salute with farting tongue pressed tightly to his teeth, and he blew back with his bugle of an arsehole.
The devil's farting, and his cheeks are puffed as the cheeks of Zephyrus blowing wind in the birth of Venus. As his cheeks are puffed and round, expelling air, so too the cheeks of Malacoda. wind is expelled. But one would imagine not the sweet wind of the spring breeze of Zephyrus, but rather the noxious wind that comes from the anus. The two of them, Virgil especially, and Dante, they'll look at one another like, how could this be happening? This is inappropriate. And that suggests, again, how we might respond to that image. On the one hand, we might laugh at it. Well, the devils laugh like little school kids. A delight, a laughter, ribald laughter, silliness, grotesqueness, but also being appalled and being reminded of what these devils are. Gross.
I think one of the most striking images in hell is the demon hacking the people's entrails out, the people falling down, kind of going round in a circle, to return to the demon, healed, so they can be kind of eviscerated again. It's a nice image of kind of eternal return, the idea that there is no let-up, there's only continual punishment. It's a good image.
Yeah, he's enjoying himself. He's smiling out at the viewer. In a sense, I think inviting the viewer to walk in and take a turn under the blade. You know, and it's that sort of thing, that kind of intimacy that you would not get in a narrative that was a fresco, a large-scale work. An intimate work where, in a sense, Botticelli is making it for someone who is looking at that privately, chuckling, you know, looking at the work, sort of musing over it, not looking at it as a whole, but looking at it point by point.
Models are usually made by kind of neurotic middle-aged men with a kind of a low self-esteem, exerting their godlike kind of power over inanimate objects. Whereas I think Botticelli's drawings are slightly more kind of worthy than that. Botticelli's drawings would have been seen by a bunch of people who believed in hell. Whereas I think the people who kind of look at our work don't believe in hell in the same way. The nastiness in our work is coloured by B-movies and bad comedy. Whereas I think the Botticelli is fueled by real kind of fear and real kind of belief in punishment.
I don't think that he was asking the viewer to relish in the torture, but to look at it and to delight in the grotesque and the horror of it. Just as we today do when we watch a horror film. One, we shield our eyes. I actually, crawl into the chair in the movie theater. Don't look. I close my eyes actually before something happens and ask my partner to, tell me when it's over. I don't want to see much of it, but I want to see a little bit, and I open my eyes and look a little. Mutilation and metamorphosis and regurgitation, where a serpent comes and attacks a figure and he's dissolved and then he's reformed again. That was a monstrosity, a violation of the divine order. And he shows that. But then he also makes designs that are compelling in terms of their beauty and lyricism. Snakes writhing, beautiful lines, sort of curving lines. So that on the one hand you have ugliness and horror of what you see, but then we also can delight in the beauty of the line.
As Dante and Virgil progress deeper into hell, the sins become more severe, the jokes stop, and burning flames give way to something worse, a biting, burning cold.
As you get further into hell, it's not so much the flames, it's this terrible coldness, the iciness, living with the consequences of turning your back on love, with the souls, as it were, frozen in the inevitability of having to face this for eternity.
Lucifer was the most gifted of angels, the one that was most loved by God. At one point, he considers himself as good as God, better than God. And that is pride. It's not pride as we use it today. It's conceit. It's worse than lack of humility. It is lack of love. You only love yourself.
Lucifer is frozen forever into a lake of ice, unable to escape.
The horror isn't like in the other drawings, which are horrific in the physical sense. This is the sheer horror of seeing the consequences of rebellion and being frozen in it forever. Cold is much more terrifying than heat, I think.
It's very strange. There's something kind of grotesque and almost farcical about it, in that you have these tiny figures of Dante and Virgil, especially in the case of Virgil, this kind of eminent poet, and they're crawling up and down this grotesque, monstrous, fur-covered body, and it is slightly absurd and hilarious. And yet there's something genuinely frightening about the figure.
Those extraordinary staring eyes full of, well, not just hatred, but sheer malice, wanting to associate others in his own misery. And of course, that's what hell is, to be actually introduced into the heart of misery, living without God.
As Dante and Virgil climb down Lucifer's body, they reach the centre of the earth. From here, the only way is up, both spiritually and physically. Botticelli designed Lucifer to be turned upside down, a joke at the devil's expense.
The rest of the work is about love. And here we have an image that is utter isolation and utter immobility, completely alien to the whole Renaissance concept of character, of personality, impotence. He can't act. In a sense, he can't even realize anything, and that is his punishment.
Remember, in the medieval period, life was much shorter than it is now, and there was a very strong sense of sin around. We've gone a bit cool on that. We think, well, you know, we had bad parents, or we're not such bad chaps after all. Purgatory came out of the conviction that most of us need a bit of tidying up when we die, being cleansed, expiating sins, being repaired in yourself, and through your prayers repairing a moral order that you've messed up a bit.
I always say you have to aim for heaven so that you don't end up in hell. If we aim at purgatory, we'll probably end up in hell as well, but purgatory is probably where most of us are going to end up for a bit, I should think.
There's a deathly silence at the very end of hell, and it's only slowly when they come through to purgatory that sounds begin to be very beautiful. And almost the first sound of purgatory is the singing of people giving praise. The souls, as they arrive, alight onto the lands of purgatory, sing out. They all have to sing to expiate their crimes, their sins, etc.
In hell, Dante was drawn downwards towards Satan. In Purgatory, Botticelli shows Dante being constantly drawn upwards towards God. But his journey will be filled with cruel torments. In a dream, Dante finds himself lifted by an eagle to the gate of Purgatory. A guardian places the letter P for peccatum, sin in Latin, on Dante's forehead, 7 times, once for each sin. Dante himself is to be purged of sin on his journey and will share in the pain of the penitents. Artists and knights atone for the pride they showed in their earthly life by carrying great rocks upon their backs. And Dante relives images of pride punished. He sees a vision of the fall of Lucifer and experiences again the horror this has brought mankind. He comes to understand that his own weakness is also pride. An angel approaches Dante and envelops him in its wings. Dante finds he can walk more easily. The angel has removed the first P from his forehead. He has been purged of pride and can move on to the next level. Envy is gazing at what you do not have, so the eyes of the envious are sewn up with wire. The wrathful must replace their rage with the praise of God. The slothful are forced to live in constant movement, as they have not loved God energetically enough on earth. The avaricious and the spendthrifts are punished together, because the sins are 2 sides of the same coin, an unbalanced relationship with money.
Purgatory is a place of great pain. What they should have done in this life, they're doing late, but better late than never. God is helping them to mature in a very painful way, and I think Botticelli catches that.
So it's quite daunting, but it's positive, because at least the souls in purgatory know they're on the way. Of course, being a priest, the sight of a pope down there with his mitre on is rather, it's a good lesson.
The gluttonous grow thin, forbidden from tasting the sweet fruit of a tree. And the lustful are purged in fire.
I think we get rather obsessed about sexual things nowadays. And in the actual gradations, it isn't the misuse of the body which is so dreadful. It's the misuse of the higher faculties of the intellect and the will. All the characters who are really subjected to the worst punishments, both in purgatory and hell, are really those who've used that faculty of the intellect against God, because pride, after all, is the original sin. And pride is expressed in so many different ways, in all sorts of contexts, the political, the social, the moral, but at the heart is this rebellion against God as the sovereign creator and redeemer.
Despite his brilliance and the kindness he's shown to Dante, Virgil was born before the Christian era, so he's barred from paradise.
There's this very solemn and moving moment when Dante, who after all is going, we hope, to heaven, is crowned by his predecessor and great mentor, Virgil, as the future poet. And quite soon after this, Virgil, who is after all damned, starts to fade away.
At the top of the Mount of Purgatory is the lost Garden of Eden, which human beings can only reach once their soul has been purged. Everyone in the garden is awaiting the arrival of Beatrice, a woman sent from God to lead Dante into divine ecstasy. The problem Botticelli faced in Paradise was to demonstrate heavenly virtues and their reward. Although he could show satisfyingly extreme punishments in hell and purgatory, the warm inner glow of virtue is hardly dramatic. The drawings in this section seem very similar, so similar that Botticelli had to number them so he could remember which was which. It's only when the drawings are seen in a sequence that a kind of movement is created between them, as Beatrice and Dante dance weightlessly through the empty space of heaven.
They're moving with these incredibly beautiful robes that they have, and she has this incredibly beautiful dress and these wonderful folds. And this idea of them dancing in paradise is one that I find incredibly beautiful. I mean, this idea of dancing, somehow Botticelli seems to understand particularly well the idea of the dance as an expression of ideal beauty and of the relationship between bodies and between figures and between minds and between, as it were, different forms of love.
Where Botticelli is really good is how he precisely calculates the amount of air drift going past Beatrice's costume, for example. It flutters a little more if she's going fast, and that kind of thing. It's so beautifully done. This kind of flick of the wrist, it'll tell you the speed, and it'll tell you the direction. Just like that. It's a nuance, and it's very easy to miss.
We all dream of flying. This is the real thing. There is no effort involved, no fear of falling. The first impression is continuous movement, movement without limits. It's a sort of infinity of space and time, which comes on like an orgasm, if I can say that in inverted commas.
I
think Botticelli is seeking to create weightlessness. The difference is that I have actually experienced weightlessness.
We may see a direct connection between the space of Botticelli and the space the astronauts afford when they go outside the gravitational field of Earth.
Il y a quelque chose d'extrêmement troublant dans les dessins de Botticelli.
There is something very erotic in Botticelli's drawings. His bodies are weightless. He places feet at impossible angles where they can't support the body. And anyway, they're not resting on anything.
There is a preview of this sort, a sort of preview of this space. And Botticelli arrived not through the experience, the scientific experience of astronauts and so on, but he arrives to this feeling through imagination and through his power of expression. And this is another task of the artist, to anticipate what people will understand later on. He creates a universe which is out of the scheme of Renaissance perspective.
I think that was very deliberate, that he was showing heaven as an otherworldly place, whereas purgatory is most like Earth, and therefore has perspective and has a sense of depth and so on. Heaven has no such thing, it has no need for such things.
Beatrice introduces Dante to the ranks of angels. One of the lowest orders of angels carries a tablet on which Botticelli has signed his name, Sandro de Mariano.
And it's tiny, tiny, tiny. And this is his way of signing the drawings. That's a really personal touch because it shows his hope of his own work, that it will, be immortal. And it's also another one of his little jokes. It's very typical that he signed his drawings in this way.
Dante and Beatrice are carried upwards in a river of light which leads ultimately to God.
It's movement and light and that image of the converging lines, apart from looking like a road on the way home, as it were, is much more than that. It's as if they're being drawn, but beyond the page, something which is ultimately inexpressible.
And even if I were as rich in words as in remembering, I would not dare describe the least part of such beauty's bliss.
Dante then experiences a vision of the Virgin Mary, the Church's most divine figure. But how was Botticelli to represent absolute perfection?
The female form is something which he was quite good at, as we know from some of his other drawings. But to express purity, he goes beyond that into this extraordinary sense of, it's not emptiness, but it's inexpressibleness.
Botticelli left the page blank.
It's perhaps the viewer who has to kind of think how to project his own idea of this eternal mother.
A lot of times blank pages in books get drawn upon by kind of the owner of the book. I think kind of a long tradition of defacing blank pages in books. Perhaps the person who owns the book's supposed to draw their own Virgin Mary on there. I would. I think heaven must be an incredibly boring place. I imagine not very much would be going on there. The popular notion of heaven wouldn't be interesting to us. I mean, good people are boring people.
Is paradise generally boring? I don't know. I think there's a vague suspicion that Inferno would be quite an interesting place to be, but that's probably because we only get to see it through Dante's eyes and nothing bad ever happens to Dante. He kind of wafts through it safely, and I suppose we all think that that's probably what would happen to us, whereas in fact we'd be down there in one of those pits being boiled alive.
I didn't get any further than hell in my book work. I got stuck quite early on in the game and got left at the far gates of hell and didn't get to purgatory, which is possibly only too true in my life.
Some moderns really live without hope, and therefore somehow hell expresses an inner torture, which is perhaps rather modern, in a sense.
In many ways, the history of the 20th century is a history of ever more refined versions of hell, isn't it?
We've been through a century, something like 150 million people have been killed violently in extermination camps and goodness knows what. I mean, genocidal massacres. It's very easy to think about hell.
These drawings by Botticelli are as modern as the most modern art. Because they're interesting to us now, I think they're modern.
Of course, now we have a funny hindsight to look at them with, which is the world of the comic book, the world of the cartoon, the world of the kind of quick lightning sketch. All that world we now feed back into it, and we can see the brilliance, possibly even more than its first audience could. To see these marks, incredibly refined, both meticulous and amazingly free, and of course makes any artist jealous to see somebody who's seen day after day to be able to draw flames and plants and Dante and Beatrice as if they saw these things every day of their lives, and Dante was his best friend and Beatrice was next door.
He is translating the Divine Comedy for you. In a way, he's doing what I try to do, in words. I didn't do it as well as he did in illustration. You don't have to have read the Divine Comedy to appreciate the drawings. The drawings will tell you the story.
Do I like the drawings? And I've gone through various periods of loving and hating them. They're like a relative. You can't get rid of them. They're part of my flesh and blood. And so when I look at my life, I think actually in terms of what circle of hell I would be in. You know, would I be lucky enough to get into Purgatorio? And then I look at Botticelli's drawings. I learn from them visually. I love the drawings. I learn from them with every glance. With each look, you see something new. They are inexhaustible.